Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Glad you could be here. Make sure that you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. We are living in a very tumultuous time. The growing international instability under this administration has been a disaster for us. And I have a great guest coming on. I have author of the book, We Win and They Lose, The Republican Foreign Policy in the New Cold War, written by Dan Negrea and Matthew Koenig. Dan, welcome to the PAS Report Podcast. How are you today?
Wonderful, wonderful, Nicholas. Thank you for having me on your call. Thank you for the great work you do for the good of our country.
Well, I mean, when you look at what's going on, it's upsetting because I was born 1980, Reagan comes into power and we win the Cold War. We go through this amazing time here in the United States, but also on the international system where there's an enormous amount of stability. I mean, it was probably one of the greatest eras of peacetime that we've ever witnessed. And I see it all being lost. I see real disasters on the horizon, a world that's at conflict with each other. And the increasing instability has me very concerned because we're seeing it on nearly every continent at this point. So that's why I'm concerned and I do what I do, because I have children and I would love for them to grow up in the world that I grew up in. Unfortunately, that's not possible right now. So I want to get to your book because I do find it fascinating that you talk about this new Cold War that has emerged. Can you explain to the audience, first the title, We Win and They Lose? Where does that title come from?
Well, you see, I mean, it takes a professor like you to start with defining the terms and getting it all sorted out and so on. So let me first start with the disclaimer. I'm a senior director of the Freedom Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council. My co-author, Matt Kroenig, who is a professor like you, he's teaching at Georgetown, but he's the senior director of the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. But the Atlantic Council is a nonpartisan institution, and we wrote a partisan book. So all the points of view that I will present today do not necessarily represent the points of view of the Atlantic Council, represent our points of view. So let's start with that. But you are right. Let's start with the title. We start with We Win, They Lose. And you mentioned the time of Reagan. This is a Reagan quote. Before he became president, about a year before, in the era of détente, he was talking to one of his advisors who told him our relationship with the Soviet Union needs to be one where we recognize that they are the rising power. We, at best, want to stay on par with them, and we need to coexist and be nice to them, and we need to appease them. And that's détente. And Reagan said, well, I have a different point of view. It's simple, maybe simplistic. How about this? We win and they lose. And that was the beginning of his policy to challenge the Soviet Union that he called the evil empire, and to base his strategy on the strength of the United States, the shining city on the hill. We had the moral superiority over the corrupt and brutal communist system. And in the end, we won. And the subtitle is Republican Foreign Policy. So it's what should be a conservative approach. But then comes something very important, which is end the new Cold War. So Matt Kroenig and I believe that we are in a new Cold War, that we have adversaries, not what the Biden administration calls competitors, because competitors are people who respect the same rules that you respect. That's not the situation.
The European Union's a competitor.
Very well put. Or Japan was a competitor in Reagan's days, exporting cars. And once we sat down and talked to them, we sorted it out. But the Chinese lie, cheat, and steal, and the Russians start wars, and the Iranians support terrorism. So these are not competitors. These are adversaries, and they are in a new axis of evil. They talk to each other, they coordinate, they're not allies, but they are aligned. So this is what we are facing, and we need to be sober in our foreign policy.
Dan, we certainly need to be sober in our foreign policy and the realities that we're facing. Now, we need to take a quick break. When we get back, I want to talk to you about the idealist vision of foreign policy versus the realist vision in this administration. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. Now, there's two competing visions when it comes to international relations. You have the idealist vision and the realist vision. As far as the idealist vision, it's basically how you want things to be. Not how they are, but how you want things to be. Where the realist vision is how things are and dealing with them accordingly. When it comes to the Biden administration, do you think that their foreign policy is based off of more the idealistic view and how they want things to be as opposed to the realities of what we're facing?
Yes, so exactly. So what we are offering are policies that are in stark contrast, almost always, to where the Biden administration is. Where they are not in stark contrast is when they are continuing the policies in the Trump administration in trade relations with China, where they're continuing some of the tariffs that we put, and we are continuing to challenge them in the sphere of the trade on items that are national security sensitive. But other than that, we are proposing a very different way of looking at things. For example, is climate change an existential threat to the United States, or is China? We argue that it is China. If we are in a Cold War, which we believe that we are, how is it imaginable that 8 million people cross illegally our southern border and 3 million of them are allowed to enter the United States? You mentioned, Nicholas, the previous Cold War. Try to imagine a situation when Soviet citizens crossed the border in the United States during the previous Cold War. Well, last year we had 24,000 Chinese citizens of military age crossing illegally the US border. We had 170 people who are on the terrorist watch list. That were apprehended at the border, and Secretary Mayorkas cannot tell us if they are in the United States or if they have been ejected. These are disturbing things if you accept the premise that we are in a Cold War. They do not accept the premise, and we are arguing that this is a fact and that we need to change our policies.
Yeah, and that's a big problem. I mean, when we see, the numbers jump from about 300 Chinese nationals crossing the border each month, and now it's 20,000 per month, I believe the number is at. China's not a place that you could easily leave. I mean, the reality is they have the social credit system. The government controls what people could do in that society. And if the government wants you to be within its borders, you're going to be within its borders. Sure, some people will be able to get out, but not 20,000 per month. And so that's something that should be concerning. Now, when you look at American foreign policy, and I could go all the way back to the Nixon administration up until present day, you had a lot of people in both Democrat and Republican administrations. Now, I thought it was a brilliant strategy on Nixon's part to create the wedge between communist China and communist Soviet Union. However, our policymakers, they look at this idea of idealism. They all believe that China would become more like the United States if we opened up to them. And it turned out that we've actually become more like China in a lot of ways and adopted, some of the communist tactics when it comes to the idea of censorship. This misguided approach allowed China to really rise over the course of the last 30 years, where there wasn't this suspicion. So I want to get into the solutions that you propose in this book, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I want to be fair. Had I lived in the days of W. Bush, who introduced the concept of China being the concept that he used was a responsible stakeholder in international relations, I probably would have done the same thing. So I grew up in communist Romania. I defected from a communist country, came to the United States. I have no illusions about communists, but I can understand how Americans at that time were hoping that China will continue the policy started by Deng Xiaoping that were a policy of opening. They allowed for a private property. It is shocking in a communist country. It was a big, big, big change. They allowed foreign investment. They traded more with the rest of the world. They softened a little bit, the oppression internally. And at the top of the Communist Party, they introduced some elements of collective leadership. They put term limits. They had reason to hope. It wasn't a crazy policy to say, hey, listen, let's encourage this direction. Now, it turns out the bet didn't work. And actually, in retrospect, we fell prey to what General McMaster calls strategic narcissism. You look at other people and you think, but certainly they want to be like us. And the people want to be like us. But the communist leaders were faced with a situation that had they continued on that path, they would have been toppled because nobody needs those guys. They are useless. They are a parasite. They are parasites on top of society. They don't produce anything. Then they are oppressive. So Xi Jinping came, stopped the process of reform, started moving back to a China that looks more and more like Mao's China, with the ubiquitous control by the Communist Party, suspicion of foreigners, less investment from foreign countries. So that was a time of hope. The hope was misplaced. Now we understand what they are. We need to be vigilant.
Do you think one of America's biggest problems is that when we look at a country like China or even Russia or Iran, that they're long-term strategic thinkers? I mean, they base their policies on decades out, where in the United States, we're short-term. I mean, we got the attention spans of gnats. And so we don't really look at what can possibly be down the road. Do you think that's one of our big problems here in the United States?
Yes, but I'll take our problem anytime because we have elections and the American people can vote, and we need to make sure that the elections are fair. That's a big thing. But assuming that they are fair and assuming that the American people speak and their votes are counted, we have a self-correction mechanism. The Chinese communists, they plan long-term, but as someone who lived there, their plans never work. I mean, there is this saying there, if the facts don't fit the theory, too bad for the facts. They create these 5-year plans. Who can plan for 5 years? The Soviet Union kept having its 5-year plans. Okay, well, they never got anywhere. So I'd much rather take our problem than their problem.
That's a good point. Now, Dan, we got to take a quick break, but when we get back, I want to talk to you about the Belt and Road Initiative because I think that's really important for people to understand. Everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Dan, the Belt and Road Initiative, this had to be one of the most brilliant policies I've ever seen. As someone that studies international politics, as someone that was in emergency management and homeland security dealing with, I mean, this really was a sophisticated plan. Did the United States drop the ball on the real intent of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, it caught us by surprise. But again, I'm a great believer, and maybe because I lived under communism, I don't think I'm biased. I think I'm accurate in my assessment. They always fail. I mean, it's a failed
Well, I
system.
think history proves you right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I like to say, if the East Germans couldn't make it work, nobody can make it work. I mean, nobody. It hasn't been successful anywhere. And then you say, oh, but look at China. China was not successful under Mao. It was a terribly poor country, took off in the era of reforms by Deng Xiaoping. So 30 years of Mao were a disaster. 30 years of reforms under Deng Xiaoping, opening to the world, introducing elements of capitalism were successful. So in the Mao, they were growing at 6% per year from a very, very low base. Under Deng Xiaoping, they were growing at an incredible 10% per year, every year. But now, with Xi Jinping going back to hard communist policies. They say they are growing at 5%, but always lie. So they are probably at 3 or 4, and even that is optimistic because communism just doesn't work. It doesn't work anywhere. So their Belt and Road thing, they are throwing a lot of money on these things. But my prediction is that in the long term, they will create more problems than have benefits. The reason being this: countries will come to China to take, by the way, they didn't give grants. These are loans, right? Let's start with that. Now, a loan, you need to repay it. They're going to poor countries that went to the World Bank, and the World Bank said, no, you don't need this road. It's the wrong place. You can't afford it, and so on. Now they go to the Chinese. The Chinese, sure, will give you the loan. And now you give me your diamond mines as collateral. Great. Now they cannot pay on the road. Now try to collect from a poor country, try to take their diamond mine. That's their crown jewel. In the long term, it's a failing strategy because communists in general are very arrogant people who think that because they're the smartest, went to the top schools, all that, they can make decisions better than markets with millions and tens of millions of voters, and it has never worked.
Yeah, that's for sure. And in your book, you talk about how the Trump administration really illuminated the threat that China poses. And when you look at one of the things that I found fascinating was the idea of North Korea. When President Trump first came into office, the whole spat with Little Rocket Man and whose red button is bigger than whom's. And so we had that spat. And then you have China, Trump sitting down with Xi, and they're having dinner, and on the television screen at the same time, we're bombing Syria because the allegations were Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons on his own people. For the first time, everyone tried approaching China when it came to North Korea based on what's in the world's best interest. The idea of North Korea denuclearizing would benefit humanity. However, China doesn't care because they know that North Korea is not using those nukes on them. So why do they care if it's going to benefit the world? How does it benefit China? Now, Trump at that meeting actually spoke Chinese language and stated, if you don't help us, well, we're going to hurt your economy. And China, for the first time, actually jumped on board, hitting North Korea with sanctions. So in your book, you focused that Trump really started to change the conversation. What are your thoughts to that?
First of all, you're absolutely. I agree with you with everything you're saying on the importance of peace through strength. It's one of the key elements that we recommend in our book to define our foreign policy: peace through strength, moving from free trade to fair trade and American exceptionalism. I think that there is a realization in both the Republican and the Democrat Party that China is a threat. There is a big difference, though, between how the Democrats are approaching it. We call them progressives in the book, and what we are proposing in the book as a policy for the GOP. If you look at how President Biden defines the relationship with China, he talks about competition, cooperation, and confrontation. And then we say in the book that he is 1/3 right. He's right about the confrontation part. It's not competition because they don't recognize rules. It's not cooperation. Progressives like to say, well, we have to cooperate with China because we have these transnational issues where we have common interests, climate change and pandemics. Where on climate change, we are decreasing our CO2 emissions. They are increasing them. And they tell us that they will continue to increase them until 2030. And they will probably increase them afterwards. And you mentioned Belt and Road. They are funding other countries to build coal mines. I mean, it's extraordinary. And supposedly we are cooperating with them. They are not doing anything. They are taking advantage of us. And then on transnational issues, or on transnational health issues, when the Australians said, let's investigate the origin of COVID, which we think is from a Wuhan lab, China imposed economic sanctions, tried to coerce, to punish Australia for asking for an investigation for the good of humanity. What we are proposing is to recognize China as not as a competitor, but as an adversary, to recognize that they're the leading threat to the United States, and we call it an existential threat, that they're leading this new axis of evil, and to design policies to counter Chinese malign actions in the military sphere, economic sphere, diplomatic sphere, and the sphere of ideas.
Now, when it comes to the idea of trade and where China stands on the level of classification, why do we still consider them? Why are they still labeled as a developing country? Why haven't they been promoted to a first world country? I know it's something that you touch on.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. They are giving all these loans, as you pointed out, in Belt and Road, but at the same time they take loans from the World Bank. How does this make sense? I think this should be one of the top priorities of the executive director representing the United States at the World Bank. Arguing for taking away their status there, and also in the World Trade Organization, because they take they derive benefits from that.
This is important because if they're listed as a first world country, that's going to change things. And I want to talk to you about that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So if China is listed as a first world country, how does that benefit America? How does that even out the playing field as opposed to China being designated a developing country? What type of benefits does China receive as a developing country, even though they're really a first world country?
So China takes loans from the World Bank as a developing country. They take these loans at concessionary rates, at lower rates than market rates. But then when China makes these Belt and Road loans to countries, they are not at preferential rates, at concessionary rate. They are at market rates. So on the money that they get from the World Bank, it's an arbitrage, and they benefit. They make the spread between the two. Also, the World Trade Organization, countries that are members of the World Trade Organization, agree that developing countries have lower tariffs when they trade with developing countries. So developed countries that are members of the WTO give these benefits to developing countries. China wants to have those benefits. Well, they don't deserve them. Because of how they claim that they've had these fantastic successes. Well, which is it?
Yeah, it's such a good point. And what do you think is China's biggest weakness? Like, what do you think is the biggest weakness that China has today?
The role of the Communist Party. The role of the Communist Party in China, like the role of all communist parties, is profoundly destructive in society, in every aspect of social life. So let me start with the most consequential one. The Communist Party. There is no country in this whole world that has ever voted, not once, in a free election for communists to rule that country. Not once. Actually, I did the check once. And there is a republic in the mountains in the Alps, I think it is, called San Marino. I think this is the only place where they vote. I'd never heard of San Marino since or before. But but that's it. So if you look at all the countries that were part of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, Poland and Czechia and Slovakia and Germany and Romania and Bulgaria, there isn't a Communist Party that was voted into power when they no longer had the instruments of coercion. So for communists to stay in power, they need to jail, torture, and kill their opponents. They kill a fertile environment of exchanging ideas. They kill creativity, they kill innovation. And then you come and you say, yeah, but look at China. They are doing so many wonderful things. Well, so did the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union in the 50s, right after the war, They were ahead of the United States in space exploration. They put the first man in space, the first woman, the first dog. They were doing great. But then over time, they fell further and further and further behind from the base because people are not free to exchange it. They're not free to travel. They're not free to think. Okay, so that's number one. In the economic sphere, the Communist Party wants to also make the final decisions and the key decisions certainly in the controlling heights of the economy, but pretty much in everything. And there also it kills innovation. In China, they favor state-owned enterprises over the private entrepreneurial enterprise. They get preferential loans. Okay, well, once you do that, you have bureaucracies. You have the post office and the IRS here, and all the enterprises are like that. So long term, they're going to fail. Our challenge is to make sure that they are not a military adversary to cause a war while they are on their way to failing.
And when it comes to the idea of the 1.3 billion Chinese people in the population, as you talked about Deng Xiaoping earlier, he lifted 600 to 800 million Chinese out of poverty into the middle class. Looking at it today, China's economy seems to be falling apart, right? And pretty much at a rapid clip right now. Do you think that China is much weaker than people pretend they are? Do you think that they're at their weakest level right now? Or do you think they'll reverse the situation?
No, they're not reversing it. It's getting worse and worse. And the danger is, I don't know if you believe it, but you certainly posed an interesting question, which is, do they have an advantage in planning long-term because they are in power forever because they kill their adversaries, right? So they have that advantage. There is a risk that I think that the leaders of the Communist Party know that the trend is down. So then the question is, will they do something drastic short term while they still have the power because they know that over time they're getting to get weaker?
Yeah, I don't think the 600 million people want to go back into poverty. I think they're going to be a little upset.
Yeah. But look, my day job when I don't write this book is to run the Freedom and Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council. And we did a report called False Promises, talking about China and Russia. And you are raising an excellent point, and we wrote a whole report about this, where we showed China by itself. And you see Chinese growth like this. And you say, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. It's a hockey stick. Look, that's great. And then you turn the page in the report, and then we show China compared with Hong Kong, with South Korea and Taiwan. And what you see there all of a sudden is the growth of China is like this, and it's South Korea and Taiwan that go like this. And South Korea, Taiwan, and China were equally poor in the 1960s, but South Korea and Taiwan, while being not free politically, were free economically. They were capitalist, and they had a sound legal system. They did better because they had capitalism while being a dictatorship than the communist dictatorship that had no economic freedom, no political, no legal. But then in 1990, both South Korea and Taiwan also acquired political freedom. And then you see them taking off. And they escaped the middle income trap, while China, you are correct, 800 million, got out of abject poverty. But the country overall is still a middle income country. It's not a high income country.
Definitely. And Dan, I really appreciate you coming on. Everyone needs to check out the book, We Win, They Lose, Republican Foreign Policy in the New Cold War. Love to have you back to keep this conversation going. Thank you so much.
Thank you for what you do for freedom.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.